Welcome back to week 10, Marine Life. And in this video 2, we are going to get into the details of how organisms within these different marine communities relate to each other. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to look at relationships by eating through the food chain. If you remember from last week, we talked about these different trophic levels. And then competition, symbiosis, and population control. So to kind of review a little bit from last week, this relationship by eating is basically who eats who. So it's a pattern of feeding relationships within an environment. And through this food chain, matter and energy are transferred from the producer to the primary consumer, to the tertiary consumer, and to the decomposer. So both matter and energy are transmitting through this food chain. And then this term trophic level is basically what level of this food chain is a specific organism based on what it eats. So if we look at, say, a cow eats grass, which is a producer, and so that cow would be classified, its trophic level would be a primary consumer. So the details of each of these, so we'll kind of review real quick here. Producers are producing their own food, so they're taking energy from someplace else, like the sun or chemical reactions, and transforming inorganic mineral nutrients into organic molecules so that the primary consumers and those further on up the food chain can actually absorb those nutrients. So we have photosynthesis, so energy from the sun, and then chemosynthesis, where we get energy that's coming from the breaking of chemical bonds. So we see chemosynthesis in areas where we don't necessarily have sunlight, so the deep oceans, caves, mines, things like that. So these are the base of our food chain. The consumers are those that consume producers or other consumers. So primary, secondary, and tertiary are the three main trophic levels. Primary consumers eat producers or autotrophs, or they're also called herbivores. My cow example would be a great example of what a primary consumer would be. Secondary consumers consume primary consumers, and they tend to kill their prey or scavenge. So we would be a good example of a secondary consumer because we are eating those herbivores, those cows. And we kill our prey and scavenge in our recent history when we were more primitive beings. And then tertiary consumers, these consume secondary consumers. They kill their prey or scavenge as well. So an example of a tertiary consumer might be maybe a lion, could be a good example, or a shark eating a secondary consumer which eats primary consumers would be a good example of one of those. So our last level are decomposers. So when things die, we have these decomposers that break down that organic matter. So these organisms consume detritus, which is dead and partially decayed plant and animal tissue, or organic wastes. And we have two main categories. We have decomposing bacteria, so these actually take that detritus and break it into inorganic compounds, which are then recycled and used by autotrophs for synthesis. And then detritus feeders actually filter detritus from the water. So they're actually hanging out and filtering water through them to get that detritus out. And so these decomposers will produce this material, these inorganic compounds, which then can be used back by those producers. So it's this ongoing cycle throughout the food chain. So some other relationships by eating is this idea of energy flow, the transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next. So basically, if we look at our food chain here, producer, primary consumer, secondary, tertiary, and then decomposers, we're going to work our way through this, going from producer all the way down to decomposer, and take a look at the energy that is first absorbed by that producer, what goes out, so it's converted into heat used for metabolism, so it's used up by that organism, and then what's the rest of the energy that's allowed to go out, so basically what's available to the next trophic level, to the next organism that's going to eat that initial producer. So when we start out here with our producer, we're going to make our numbers easy at first. So our producer takes in 100% of its energy from the sun. So we take in through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, depending on what type of organism we're looking at here. But in this case, we're going to use a photosynthetic bacteria as our example. So they take 100% of its energy from the sun. It uses 60% of that energy, so that stuff is lost, it's gone, and then there's 40% left for the next trophic level, so that cow or sea urchin that comes along can consume that producer through grazing. So it takes that 40% that's available to it, absorbs that. It uses 24%, so that 24% is not available to the next trophic level. And then 16% of that initial 40 is left for the next consumer. So we go on to the next one, and we have our secondary consumer eating that primary consumer. So say we have a seagull eating that sea urchin, they ate that maybe photosynthetic bacteria, or ate that kelp that was photosynthesizing in the ocean. So it has 16% of that initial 100% that the producer once absorbed. So it only has 16% left. The secondary consumer uses 10% of that energy, and then 6% is left for the next trophic level. So you can see as we get higher and higher in our food chain, there's less and less energy left for those tertiary consumers. So then our last leg, our tertiary consumer, so this is taking and scavenging or hunting that secondary consumer, and it has 6% of that initial 100% available to it, and uses 4%, and then 2% is left over to be decomposed. And so depending on where this next one, switching to the decomposer, depending on which one of these organisms is actually breaking down, you're going to have a different number here. So if it's the tertiary consumer that dies and starts to decay, 2% is left for that decomposer. If it's the secondary consumer, it's going to be 6%. And if it's that primary consumer, it's going to be 16%. So that number is going to vary depending on where you are. So basically, as you move from producer to the top of the food chain, the amount of energy available to that tertiary consumer is decreased significantly. So those tertiary consumers have to eat a lot more to get that energy. So that's our relationship through eating. So the next idea is through competition and symbiosis. So within one of these living spaces, this ecosystem, these organisms are competing not only for resources or food, but they're also competing for living space. If there's not enough living space, then those organisms either have to move to the next tide pool or they end up dying. This other idea of symbiosis. The symbiosis is a relationship between two organisms, so the species that actually help or depend on one another and live with one another. A good example of this would be on the land, on rocks, you have lichen that grows on rocks, and lichen is actually a fungus and an algae that live together. The fungus provides the house, basically the structure, and the algae is what's providing the food. So they're both providing something to this relationship, but they both really depend on one another. So these relationships do exist in the ocean as well. So this idea of diversity, so if you have an ecosystem that has a whole bunch of different types of organisms, this actually will improve population stability. So the more diversity you have, the more stable your population is, because we have lots of different things in there that maybe can adapt to different environments a little bit easier than all the same thing that if one maybe salinity changes dramatically, affects that one population, it's done. Whereas if you have a high diversity, maybe a small percentage is that organism that's really sensitive to salinity changes, and just that one organism dies off in that community. So it's kind of better to have higher diversity in your ecosystem. And this whole idea of population, so what is population? It's the number of organisms of a single species in an ecosystem, and this is dependent on birth and death rates. So how does population change? Well, we have a few things. Environmental conditions can affect the organisms, also feeding relationships, and we also have reproduction as well. So in this case here, we're going to go through some scenarios going from producer, primary consumer, and secondary consumer. We're going to play around with the numbers. So in our first case, you see that producers are yellow, primary consumers are blue, and secondary consumers are red. So in this case, we have increased our producers. So let's say we have an algal bloom in an ocean or in an estuary. So we rapidly increase the number of producers in an environment. So you see that yellow line just spikes right up. And in response to that, both the primary consumer and secondary consumer increase in population as well. More food available equals healthier organisms, can support more babies and more numbers and more higher population, so we can increase our population. If we do the opposite here and decrease our producers, so maybe there's some kind of mass die-off, maybe there's some kind of insecticide or not insecticide, herbicide that gets into a water body and flushes out through an estuary and kills off a lot of these producers. Well, we don't have the producers, we don't have enough food to support the primary consumers. Primary consumers are going to start to die off, and then in response to that, our secondary consumers are also going to decrease in number because they are relying on the primary consumer. So that producer numbers is really a driving force in what's happening in the upper levels of the food chain. So we can also take a look at our primary consumer numbers and see what happens when we increase those. So say we end up with a baby boom. We have a whole bunch of these primary consumers that exist. They increase in number. Well, because these are increasing in number, we have a response of our secondary consumer increasing in numbers because we have more food available. But our producers, because they're being eaten by those primary consumers, producer numbers go down. And then you can see at the very end here, this blue line eventually goes back down because they're consuming too many of these producers. There's not enough food to go around, so our primary consumer numbers decrease as a result. So we see this initial spike and then a decrease in producer numbers, but then because they can't support all these new primary consumers, the numbers go back down. So what happens if we decrease the primary consumers? Well, the opposite happens. We decrease primary consumers. Less of these primary consumers are eating those producers, so we end up increasing the amount of producers available. And then because we have a higher volume of producers, we end up increasing our primary consumers as a result. And then here, secondary consumer responds to that primary consumer. As it decreases in population, so does it, because it is eating the primary consumers. So we can also do this for secondary consumers. We can increase the amount of secondary consumers, and as we do that, we decrease the amount of primary consumers. And because we're decreasing the amount of primary consumers, we end up increasing the amount of producers. So our secondary consumers, there's more of them are eating those primary consumers, so they decrease in number, so then there's less primary consumers to eat the producers, so the producer numbers increase. And then our last scenario here is to play around with decreasing secondary consumer numbers. And so what happens, we decrease the secondary consumers, there's less of them to eat the primary consumers, their numbers increase, but because there's more primary consumers eating the producers, the producer numbers go down as a result. So that wraps up how these organisms are related to each other in a community, mainly through food and eating relationships. So we change our population numbers, you change kind of what the other trophic levels are doing as well. So make sure you're familiar with how if we increase the producers, what happens to our primary consumers, what happens to our secondary consumers. That's a good test question right there. So we'll stop and come back in the next video and talk about the main types of communities in the oceans.